All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. You can find your seats. All right. Thank you so much for being here today for our afternoon seminar. My name is Cinnamon Moffett, and I'm the Research Program Manager here at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center, located in Newport, Oregon. For those of you, I see some new faces in the room, so welcome everybody. For those of you that are new to this whole kind of seminar series, this is a hybrid event, so we have a good number of folks that are online with us as well. For folks online, welcome. If you have any technical questions, go ahead and put them into the chat. Our volunteer Mike, hi Mike, is going to help us out and will address any issues you might have. But we will be answering questions at the end, so you can put those questions into the chat box at any time for our speaker, and we'll get to them at the end. For folks in the room, because this is a hybrid event, we're also going to do questions at the end, but you will need a mic to be able to ask those questions so folks online can hear those questions. There are two ways that you can get a mic when we open up for our question and answer session. Raise your hand and watch me run around and I'll bring the mic to you. Or you can use the mic stand that's up there, and we'll answer those questions as they come in. For today's speaker, we're very excited to have her here, but I have a couple of quick announcements that I wanted to make. Today's talk is kind of the start of a three-part series. We have today's talk on sea otters. We also have a talk at Marine Science Day on Saturday from Dr. Sarah Gravem, who's going to be talking about the sunflower sea star and the changes in their population and the impacts on the kelp beds off our coast. And then at the end of the month, our Science on Tap, which is the 26th of this month, we have Tom Calvanese and Ford Evans that are going to be talking about sea urchins and their impact on our kelp forests. So very excited to have these three very powerful, very exciting talks kind of in the same month. If you need any information about those talks, you can go to the HMSC website, go to the event page, and you can pick either Science on Tap or Marine Science Day and get all the information you might need to log into those events. But the reason that we're all here is for today's speaker. And so I'm going to do a quick introduction. And I'm already nervous about saying her last name, and we've been practicing it, but I'm going to try anyway. So for today, we have Michele Zwartjes, is the field supervisor for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the Oregon Coast Field Office located here at Hatfield. She works with conservation and recovery of threatened and endangered species in the Pacific region for more than 20 years. She has authored the Services Feasibility Assessment and Sea Otter Reintroduction of the Pacific Coast that was released in July of 2022. With co-authors Lillian Cartwell and Michele St. Martin, and that's what she's going to be talking to us about today. So we are very excited to have today's speaker, and she has a lot to cover, so I'm going to hand it off to her. Yeah, go live.
All right. Everyone hear me okay? Hopefully. All right, great. Thank you. Thanks, Cinnamon. So my name is Michele Zwartjes. I'm the field supervisor for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. Oh, it's bright. Oregon Coast Field Office. We are fortunate enough to be situated here on the beautiful Hatfield campus. So thank you for joining us today. I'm going to be talking about sea otters and why we are having conversations about potential reintroduction of sea otters. And this is not working. Okay. I'm going to go to the mouse. See if this works. That's weird. It was working before. Hold on. I'm going to try it one more time. But shouldn't I be able to use the remote?
Okay, now try.
There we go. Thank you very much. Okay. So just a little roadmap, what we're going to be talking about today. Be going very quickly through the biology and life history of sea otters and talking about their near extinction and recovery, covering their Keystone role, and then talking about why we are considering reintroduction. I'll go through the primary conclusions of our feasibility assessment that was released last year, and then talking about next steps. So starting off, just talking about sea otters and their background. They are members of the weasel family, or Mustelidae. So they are related to badgers, weasels, even wolverines. A lot of people think of them as cute, but you would be very mistaken to think that they are cuddly. So they are the largest member of the weasel family. There are three recognized subspecies of sea otters. We'll look at a map of those in just a second. They're described based primarily on skull morphology, but also some genetic differences. And then something of interest for us here in Oregon is that we have evidence from middens that show that historically, Oregon was a transition zone between the southern sea otter and northern sea otter species. So we are a source of a genetic climb. So here's where the three subspecies occur today. The northern sea otter in purple there on the left-hand side of the screen. In Russia, it's also called the Asian sea otter. The northern sea otter or Alaskan sea otter stretching across the Aleutians there. You can see that many of the populations we have were formerly translocated up in Canada and in Washington. And then the southern sea otter on the central California coast, also known as the California sea otter. There are two of these populations that are currently listed under the Endangered Species Act, the Southwest Alaska Distinct Population Segment of sea otters and the California or Southern sea otter. So sea otters, as I mentioned, are the largest member of the Macelidae family. They get up to about 88 pounds. The males are larger than females. Really large Alaskan males can get up to almost 100 pounds. Something that's really important to know about sea otters and something that drives a lot of their life history characteristics is the fact that unlike other marine mammals, they do not have a blubber layer to keep them warm in the frigid waters. So they rely instead on very dense coat of hair. Their underfur is up to 10 million hairs per square inch. And they, if you ever watch otters, they're grooming all the time. They're very meticulous groomers. They're maintaining a layer of air between their skin and the water. So the water never actually touches their skin because of that grooming and those thick hairs. They also have an extremely high metabolic rate to help keep them warm. So compared to terrestrial mammals of the same size, their metabolic rate is about 3 times as high. So they require a lot of energy to keep that furnace going and keep them warm. They're one of the only non-primate animals known to use tools. The picture here is a sea otter using a rock as an anvil to break open its hard shell prey. And a little fun fact is that they've got these big loose folds of skin under their arms that they use as pockets. And if they have a particularly favorite stone, they'll carry it around in that pocket. Or when they go forage for clams or urchins or whatever, they can bring several up at one time by tucking them into those pockets. So sea otters generally segregate by sex. They are in large groups called rafts, and those will tend to be females with subadults or pups. And then there's separate kind of bachelor male groups. The female groups are very often guarded by one large territorial male who will defend those females from other males. They only have a single pup per year, and they have delayed maturation in terms of reproduction. The females live a little bit longer than males, up to 15 to 20 years. Males 10 to 15 years. And something that's important for considering a lot of questions around reintroduction is that they do have very high site fidelity. So they tend to stay in the same area all their lives and not range very far, with the exception of dispersing young males on occasion. And they have relatively small home ranges for a marine mammal. So there are nearshore species because they have to dive for their food. They have to dive often. They stay very close into shore, and they're limited by their diving range. They can dive up to 100 meters in depth, but that's pretty rare for them to do that. They much prefer to stay in waters less than 40 meters in depth, and even better, less than 25. So they tend to be very close into shore, usually within 3 kilometers. There are exceptions to that if the shelf extends out quite a way. Their primary prey are benthic invertebrates, so they'll eat things like clams, crabs, urchins, sea snails, tube worms. They're generalist predators. They've been documented eating up to 150 species of prey items. As I mentioned, they have a high metabolic rates, and they do eat the equivalent of 20 to 30% of their body weight every day. So that can be anywhere from like 8 pounds to 25 pounds of food a day. So they do have high consumption rates. They're found in diverse substrates, not only rocky habitats where you have canopy-forming kelps, although those are very helpful for sea otters for providing protection and shelter. It's not essential. So they also occur in soft sediment systems where kelps are not present. So in the 1700s, 1741, 1742, sea otters were first discovered by European explorers in the Commander Islands of Russia. And once they collected a couple samples of sea otter pelts and brought them back, they were soon recognized for being very luxurious furs and became extremely valuable. So this graph shows the sea otter trade taking off in the late 1700s when tens of thousands of sea otters started to be harvested at that time. And then after this meteoric rise, then you started to see the harvest of skins drop off again there around 1800. And eventually, when it gets really low, it's about the point where the Fur Seal Treaty Act of 1911 came in. You often will read that that's what protected sea otters from extinction. That's true. It did offer protections to the sea otter, even though they're not fur seals. They were included in that treaty. But what really happened is that there were so few sea otters left at that point in time that it wasn't profitable to hunt them anymore. They just couldn't be found. So here's the historical distribution of sea otters. They were once found all across the North Pacific Rim, from the northern islands of Japan, across the Kamchatka Peninsula, the Aleutian Islands, and down the Pacific coast, all the way down into Baja California. The global estimate, I should mention, is 300 sea otters. Oops. But then after the maritime fur trade, by the early 1900s, those numbers had been reduced by an estimated 99% of population. So it's estimated that by the early 1900s, we only had from a few hundred to perhaps 1,000 or 2,000 sea otters left in the world in these 11 highly isolated populations, most of them being up in the far reaches of Alaska. There is that one population that you see down there off the coast of California, Big Sur, California. Those were actually thought to be extinct for a very long time. And then in 1938, a small group of about 50 sea otters was sighted off the coast of California. And that small remnant population survived and are the source of all the sea otters that we have in California today. They're all derived from those 50 individuals. So the current distribution of sea otters, what you see here in purple, those are populations that have recovered naturally over time. The areas in blue are where translocations have taken place, and we'll talk a bit more about those in a minute. But about 33%, a third of all sea otters today are the result of past reintroductions that have taken place. And what we're going to be focusing on is this large gap in the historical range that still persists today between the central outer coast of Washington and the central coast of California at about Half Moon Bay, south of San Francisco. So I said that a third of the sea otters today were the result of past translocations. There were some experimental ones in the Pribilofs in the 1950s, but most of the translocations happened in the late 1960s, early 1970s. In several different places. Southeast Alaska had several different translocations that took place there, British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon as well. And the reason those occurred is that the Department of Defense was going to be doing underwater nuclear testing at Amchitka Island in Alaska. And that was one of the few places where sea otters had survived the fur trade, and now they had nuclear testing coming. So the Alaska Department of Fish and Game went ahead and captured a bunch of those animals and moved them to these other sites to try and repopulate their former historical range. That included Oregon. In 1970-71, we received 93 sea otters down on the southern coast in Port Orford and Cape Arago. The Oregon translocation is the only one that was not successful of those translocations. We had, as happens with all of these, I should say, there's often a very high level of dispersal immediately. These animals are very imprinted on their home ranges. Generally, when you translocate a wild sea otter, it'll immediately leave and try to go back home. So 90% loss of individuals is not unusual at the beginning. So that happened with all these populations, but Oregon's population did hang on for about 10 years. We got up to about 23 animals. They produced pups during that time, but eventually it blinked out. Some people think that some of the otters that left and moved north may have joined the individuals that were reintroduced off the Washington coast and helped to establish that population. But it was attempted and was not successful here, but it was everywhere else. So why are we again looking at reintroduction? There's a couple different reasons. One is that for the southern sea otter, which is listed under the ESA, they have long wanted to expand the range and create additional populations of that subspecies to achieve recovery. Here in Oregon, there's a nonprofit group called the Alaka Alliance that has been advocating for sea otter reintroduction for some time. And so that has started the conversation up in the public discourse. And there's also been some research that's come out of this institution, the Marine Mammal Lab here, that looked at habitat suitability on the Oregon coast and evaluated the potential for reintroduction. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Then more recently, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service received direction directly from Congress in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021. They directed us to study the feasibility and cost of restoring sea otters to the contiguous Pacific coast of the United States. So that's the study that came out this last July. And what I wanted to call your attention to is that when Congress gave us this direction, they pointed out that the key reason they wanted us to consider sea otter reintroduction is because of the critical role that sea otters play as a keystone species in the structure and environment of the nearshore marine ecosystem. So what is a keystone species? Sea otter is probably the classic, most well studied example of a keystone species, the one that we all took biology. You probably had a little diagram in your book about sea otters as a keystone species. It's an animal that has a disproportionate effect on its environment relative to its abundance. So just a very few animals can have very widespread effects on its environment. And in the case of the sea otter, it does this by its predation pressure on sea urchins in particular. So sea urchins are herbivores. They eat kelp. If there are too many sea urchins, they will eat all of the kelp. And you're left with this kind of moonscape under the water that you have no kelp left and all these urchins that remarkably do not starve to death. They just kind of atrophy and go into this stasis waiting for more food to arrive. And it can be years that they're there. So sea otters have a beneficial effect by eating the urchins. So they keep the urchin numbers in control. If they keep the urchin numbers in control, you can have these big, healthy kelp forests that then provide structure and habitat for hundreds of other species. So the importance of redundancy in predators in the ecological system became really apparent in 2014 when we had the advent of sea star wasting disease on the Oregon coast. So we already didn't have, sea otters were gone. They were not preying on the sea urchins. And then we lost all of our sea stars too. And what we saw was this explosion in the purple sea urchin population. So this article is citing to a 10,000% increase in purple urchins off the southern coast of Oregon. And you can, again, see the photo there that shows the impact that they've had. In California and in Oregon, not only did we have sea star wasting disease, we've had this series of marine heat wave events. All of these things have kind of created this perfect storm that has led to, unfortunately, the loss of more than 90% of the kelp forests on the Northern California coast. So this has had really devastating impacts on many different species, including abalones, which also feed on drift kelps. So it's really been problematic. It's really interesting to see how often this sea otter urchin kelp trophic cascade has been consistently demonstrated in the environment. And this was done most recently with this kind of natural experiment off the coast of British Columbia, where Ann Solomon and Jen Burt had photo points set up. They're looking at the numbers of sea urchins in that area, in areas where the sea otters were present or not. And then what you see there at the bottom is that in one site between 2013 and 2014, sea otters recolonized the area. So they had baseline data from before and after sea otter recolonization. And what you can see in the orange lines there on the graph is that once sea otters arrive, the sea urchin biomass drops off sharply and then is just maintained at a much lower level. And the effect on the environment is pretty striking. So here's the same photo point, just 1 year apart. So you can see on the left there in 2013, you've got an urchin barren, and just 1 year later, you've got the canopy forming kelps coming back. So this, I can't promise that this would happen everywhere, but it has been demonstrated multiple times. It could be on different time scales. A lot of times that'll fluctuate in and out of this kind of state, but we do see very consistently a positive response of kelps to recolonization by sea otters in areas where they were formerly absent. The other ecosystem service that sea otters can provide through their indirect effects on kelps and seagrasses is carbon sequestration. So in this work by Wilmers et al., they found that areas, again in British Columbia, that had kelp forests and sea otters were present, was storing 12 times as much carbon as areas where sea otters were absent and there were no kelps. There's also another trophic cascade that occurs with sea otters. This was the work of Brent Hughes in Elkhorn Slough, Monterey area of California. That's an eelgrass dominated system. There's a lot of nutrient loading. There's a lot of agriculture that happens in that area. So a lot of nitrogen in the system. And what happens is that the seagrasses get covered by these algal epiphytes. And normally those are grazed on by things like sea hares, these what's called mesograzers in this diagram, that will help to strip those off. But what happened is that without sea otters, there were so many of these little kelp crabs and other crabs in the system eating all the sea hares that they weren't there to remove the algal epiphytes, and the seagrasses were getting smothered. And what he found was that once sea otters came back into the system, they had a 600% increase in seagrass biomass because they were controlling the crabs and allowed the sea hare populations to rebound and again clean off the algal epiphytes on the seagrasses. The other thing that's been found more recently with seagrasses is that up in British Columbia, the disturbance from sea otters digging for clams in the soft sediments where the seagrasses were growing disturbed the roots of the seagrasses. That prompted them to flower and promotes sexual reproduction rather than clonal reproduction. So it resulted in enhanced genetic diversity of seagrasses when sea otters were present. So there's all these different positive ecosystem effects that come along with sea otters as a keystone species. That prompted the reason that Congress asked us to look at reintroduction. And what we did is we used the IUCN framework for assessing conservation reintroductions. The IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They put out this very nice set of guidelines that would help you to work through this kind of framework for when you should consider the possibility of reintroducing a species for conservation purposes. And the criteria they laid out were, first of all, to ask, will the reintroduction result in a net benefit to the species and to the ecosystem? And then secondly, to assess whether reintroduction might be a viable option by evaluating feasibility from a biological, legal, and socioeconomic perspective, and also to evaluate the risk of a reintroduction. And that can be thought of in terms of what are the uncertainties around the reintroduction, and then are there any kinds of offsets or methods for potentially reducing risk that might make it an acceptable option. So again, the area that we're looking at is the entire Pacific coast. Up there at the top in the dark purple, you can see that's where northern sea otters currently occupy Washington. And then the dark orange in the middle of California is where the southern sea otters are. And we concentrated for our study on this largest remaining gap in the historical range of the sea otter. We decided, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but it's in the introduction to our feasibility study. For various reasons, we decided this would have the greatest conservation value for sea otters, and we decided it was the most feasible, as opposed to considering reintroduction all the way down into Mexico. So the goals and objectives of a reintroduction on the species level would be to restore genetic connectivity between northern and southern sea otters, get that gene flow going again, enhance the genetic diversity of those subspecies which had been lost during the fur trade, and for the southern sea otter in particular, to expand the range and create additional populations of the species. For ecosystem function, we just talked about all the different benefits that sea otters can have in terms of restoring ecosystem function and enhancing climate resilience in these systems. So our assessment from a biological standpoint, we know that suitable habitat and prey are available. This is based on some of the studies that came out here from Oregon State University. The asterisk there is to note that once specific reintroduction sites are identified, we need to do further baseline assessments, and specific reintroduction sites have not yet been identified. Talked about all the positive ecological effects. We did not find any negative ecological effects from sea otters. And then finally, just their experience from past reintroductions. We could certainly improve on what had been done in the past. We've got much better ideas about husbandry now, but we know it can be done just because it has already successfully been achieved in the past. So legal feasibility. There's nothing that would legally preclude the reintroduction of sea otters. There's a whole bunch of different laws and regulations that would be involved. I'm just going to talk about two of them. So although nothing would preclude reintroduction, there are some constraints that are important to be aware of under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. One of them is the take moratorium. You cannot take marine mammals. And what that means is that, for example, some stakeholders have asked us, could you cull them if they became too abundant? And no, you cannot. The Marine Mammal Protection Act does not allow for that. There is an exception for subsistence hunting for sea otters under the MMPA, but that very specifically applies only to Alaska coastal natives. It would not apply to indigenous peoples in the lower 48. The other thing is that under the MMPA, there are specifically there's specifically language that exempts the southern sea otter or California sea otter from being authorized for incidental take from commercial fisheries. So that means if you're a fisherman and you accidentally take a sea otter, you would technically be in violation of the MMPA. That has never been enforced to my knowledge in California, but again, it's something to be aware of if southern sea otters were used as a source. Under the ESA, a lot of the protections that people often are apprehensive about that come along with the ESA, we've got actually some more flexibility there than we do under the MMPA, because we could, and we do recommend, if southern sea otters are used as a source population, reintroducing them as an experimental population under Section 10J of the ESA, which allows us to remove a lot of those restrictions, and also no critical habitat would be required. So it is legally feasible, although some aspects of the law that you might want to consider making some changes. I'll give us a very quick detour here into a legal lesson that we learned from one of the introductions that happened in California more recently. This was in the 1980s. Again, they were looking to establish an additional breeding colony of sea otters because, you know, the basic principle of conservation biology, if you've got all of your individuals in one single population, if there's some catastrophic event, such as an oil spill or serious disease outbreak, you could lose all of those individuals in one fell swoop. So they wanted some redundancy in their population. So the late 1980s, they started looking at potential translocation sites to establish another population. They considered Southern Oregon, Northern California, and San Nicolas Island in the Channel Islands off Southern California. And they decided on San Nicolas Island. But there were some complications because at that point in time, under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, there was no authority available to them to actually capture and move animals for a translocation. Today, you can get a permit, it's been updated, but back then there wasn't. So they actually had to pass a separate federal law to accomplish this translocation. And it was Public Law 99625. And in addition to authorizing the establishment of this new population of sea otters through translocation, it also made some concessions to fishery folks down there in California who were concerned about what impact the translocated sea otters might have on their fisheries. And as part of that, what they did is they established something called zonal management, So you had two different zones. You had the translocation zone where the otters were supposed to stay. And then you had this no otter management zone. And if otters moved into that management zone, this law required that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the California Department of Fish and Game had to go in and remove those otters and take them back to the translocation zone. So here you can see San Nicolas Island in the middle there, and that white area surrounding it is the translocation zone where otters are supposed to stay. And then the shaded area is the management zone where no otters were to stray. Well, wouldn't you know, these otters just flagrantly disregarded the Federal Register notice, did not read it, paid no attention, went right out into the management zone. They immediately had high levels of dispersal away from San Nicolas Island. And then in subsequent years, when animals would go out into that management zone, proved to be extremely hard, first of all, to find them. People would call in a report, there was a sea otter. Of course, this is way back, before we had GPS systems, all that. And people would go out and try to find it. They couldn't find it. And when they did find it, there were very often subsequent injuries or even mortalities from trying to capture it and move it back. So it just really proved to be untenable. So that program was declared a failure and terminated in 2012. And it resulted in a lot of really bad feelings. People who felt betrayed that the Fish and Wildlife Service had, promised that we would go in and remove these otters, and then we terminated the program and didn't follow through. So there's a couple lessons that we took away from this. One is that we will never ever again do zonal management, and we made that very clear in our feasibility study. But the other thing is, I think we need to be extremely forthright with people and say, we can make our very best educated assessment of where we think sea otters will thrive and do well, and we can move them there and hope that they will stay there. But we absolutely cannot promise people that they will stay there. Sea otters are going to go where it's best for them. So I think it's very important that we be ultra transparent about that as we talk about future reintroductions. So socioeconomic feasibility is where we had the greatest uncertainty in our study. There's a whole host of different impacts and benefits. The impacts can be fit pretty neatly, I think, into 2 or 3 categories. One of them is shellfish fishery impacts. We know that where sea otters become established, if they are overlapping with shellfish harvest, they're going to impact that harvest. And it can be a significant impact. Those shellfish will be reduced in abundance, and then over time they will become reduced in size. And that's just the reality of the situation. And again, I think we need to be very cognizant of that fact. There are reasons that we think that will remain relatively localized and that significant region-wide impacts would not occur. I'll talk about that in a bit, but nonetheless, something to be aware of. There's also those regulatory requirements that I talked about that would be potentially hamper or be seen as impacts to some fishermen in particular. And fishermen have also expressed to us that they are concerned that their kind of traditional way of life could be affected by sea otter reintroduction. The benefits are a little bit more varied in nature, ranging from those ecosystem services that we talked about to benefits to the finfish fishery. So the seagrasses and kelps that are enhanced by the presence of sea otters are good nursery habitats for a lot of commercially important fishes. So that would be beneficial. Ecotourism benefits could be quite substantial. We'll talk in a minute about some of the studies that have been done in both California and in British Columbia, showing that the dollars that can flow into coastal communities from people who want to come see sea otters and experience them, go out in kayaks and see them, take pictures, whatever, and the associated service industries can be quite lucrative. And then there's cultural values, restoring sea otters to indigenous peoples who have these historical connections with them. And then just existence value. A lot of people see value in righting a historical wrong, bringing a species back to the ecosystem to which it belongs, and just viewing sea otters. So this was an interesting study that was done a couple years ago by Ed Greger and published in Science. he actually went through and monetized the ecosystem services that are provided by sea otters in British Columbia. So what he found is that comparing areas that had otters versus areas that do not have otters in British Columbia, there's 37% greater biomass in areas with otters, and that's both kelps and these various other organisms, including finfishes. So when you look at the economic gains associated with services provided by sea otters, you've got gains in the finfish fishery from the value of carbon sequestration, and also quite significant gains from ecotourism, totaling more than $53 million per year. And then in comparison, the losses to invertebrate fisheries were $7 million a year. So if you were looking at this on a purely kind of monetary cost benefit analysis, you would say, well, you know, clearly there are significant gains to be had from having sea otters present. But what I want to emphasize is that these aren't just numbers, these aren't just statistics. There are real people behind these numbers. So when we talk about losses to invertebrate fisheries, there are fishery families that will be affected by this, and you know, people whose livelihoods depend on it. So I think that's why it's so important that as we face this challenge of, well, how do we maximize the gains and potentially minimize what those losses might be, that we involve all the members of the coastal communities, and particularly the fisher people, in talking about how to make reintroduction work if possible, that would minimize effects to them. So here's one thing I'll talk about that I've heard about from a lot of people who are concerned about sea otters coming back to the Oregon and Northern California coasts. And that is that they're concerned that our coastline will become like Southeast Alaska. A lot of fishermen here also fish up in Alaska, and they have seen how many sea otters are up there. I can't remember if I mentioned it before, but 90% of all the sea otters in the world today are in Alaska. So that's where they're all concentrated, and Southeast Alaska in particular has very high numbers of otters. And one reason for this is that if you look at this map of Southeast Alaska, you can see how highly convoluted that coastline is. There's a number of bays and inlets that sea otters can utilize. These waters are very shallow. If you're a sea otter in this area, what the work of Dr. Tim Tinker showed using this diffusion model is that otters in this area can go in any direction and find good habitat, and it'll almost all be within their foraging range. So they can do extremely well there, and they have. Their populations have grown by about 15 to 20% per year there. Now let's look at California. If you look at California, it's a very different kind of coastline. It's very linear, there's not a lot of complexity, and I'm not showing it here, but it's got a narrow continental shelf. So there's not a really wide range of area where sea otters can range off of that coastline and forage. They can basically go north and south and out just a little bit, but that's it. So they very quickly become resource limited in the center of that range. And their growth rate there has been very, very slow, about 3 to 5% per year. And in fact, that population has not expanded to the north or south in more than 20 years. So we expect that, given the similarities between the California coast and the Oregon coast, we're much more likely to see growth on the order of what we've observed in California than what we've observed in Southeast Alaska. The other thing that we did in our study is we did an analysis using bathymetric data from Southeast Alaska and areas where sea otters occur, and compared it to Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, looking at the amount of area that's available potentially to sea otters at their various foraging depths. So that blue bar is their preferred foraging depths, up to 25 meters. How much is available at 25 to 40 is in orange, and then up to 100 meters is in gray. So I think you can see, if you compare how much habitat is available for foraging otters in Southeast Alaska compared to Oregon, there's far less here. Doesn't mean we can't support sea otters, we can, but this is why we feel quite confident that Oregon just simply could never support tens of thousands of sea otters, as you see in Southeast Alaska. So this is the work that was done by Dominic Kone in his master's thesis here at OSU, working with Lee Torres in the GEM Lab and with Dr. Tim Tinker. And he modeled the carrying capacity of the Oregon coast using a number of different variables, and came up with a predicted carrying capacity of about 4,500 sea otters. And the areas that would be support the highest densities are shown there. The warmer colors support higher densities of sea otters, and the areas that are outlined in black are the very highest. So there's just a few areas along the coast, up there by Astoria, Newport and Depot Bay, and then down on the south coast, Port Orford, Cape Blanco, Brookings areas, and also outside of Charleston are all identified there. So again, this is kind of at a gross level, and more work would need to be done, but this is a good starting point for us to look at in terms of habitat suitability on the Oregon coast and potential carrying capacity. Dr. Tim Tinker further took this information. He looked at a couple of different reintroduction scenarios, say, well, how long would it take to reach that carrying capacity? And his estimate was from 200 to 300 years is how long it would take to reach that number of sea otters. And again, what we're talking about with carrying capacity is that every potential available habitat would be supporting the maximum number of otters it could to reach those numbers. So this just shows projected population growth under a couple different scenarios. What I'll get to here in a minute is what we would recommend if we were to go forward with reintroduction is to establish just a couple of small populations that would naturally grow over time. And what we're talking about when we're talking about small populations is a goal of from 100 to 200 sea otters in a population within 25 years. So not huge numbers of sea otters. So this shows a projection of initially translocating 100 sea otters 25 years later in Port Orford, which is probably some of the best habitat available in the state of Oregon. 25 years later, you would have 73 sea otters on average. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty, which is the gray bar there, but it doesn't exceed more than about 120, 150 otters at most there. And then another projection looks at a initial translocation of 100 sea otters that are then supplemented with an additional 3 subadults per year over 10 years. And that would have a higher result with 176 otters on average after 25-year period. Again, with that confidence interval around it, but I think the maximum is around 300 for that. So the conclusions from our study, in terms of whether or not reintroduction is a viable conservation option, we determined, yes, it is feasible on all fronts, that there would be significant benefits to the species and to the ecosystem from reintroduction. But we also identified work needed to address those uncertainties and socioeconomic impacts in particular. But it's this conclusion that there would be significant benefits to the species and to the ecosystem, which is prompting the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to continue considering the potential reintroduction of sea otters, but there's not yet any kind of proposal to reintroduce sea otters. So the next steps, as outlined in the assessment, and the asterisk is there to remind me to say that these are just our recommendations. This is not like a regulatory requirement or anything. This is just what we recommended. We recommended initiating a facilitated decision-making process and engaging stakeholders to help us go through this process of developing criteria for selecting potential reintroduction sites. And the idea behind that is to enable us to do these more targeted socioeconomic impact assessments in those areas. And so right now we're in the process of scheduling some open houses all along the coast of both Oregon and Northern California to talk to people and to gather information to help us in taking these next steps. And we're hoping to be starting those in late June of this year. The other recommendation we made was to plan a couple of experimental pilot projects to try some reintroduction strategies that have not been attempted yet. One of those is to use surrogate reared southern sea otter pups as a source. And that has been tried in Elkhorn Slough, but there was already an established sea otter population there. The idea behind that is that it would increase retention because those animals are not already imprinted on a home range and are more likely to stay once you move them. But that has not been attempted yet where you don't have an established sea otter population already. The other recommendation was to consider releases into a more sheltered estuary environment where you have a little bit more control over what's going on with the sea otters. You can recapture them if you need to. They're protected from predators. So that's something to consider as well. But again, the objective that we set was very small, strategically placed stepping stone populations to achieve that natural reconnection between northern and southern sea otters, and then to allow those populations to very slowly grow and expand on their own over time. So everyone's always wanted to know what's the timeline for this. So again, I just mentioned we're starting these open houses, hopefully early this summer, to continue with our information gathering, which we expect will continue for the next couple of years. As we do engage stakeholders in helping us to come up with these criteria for selecting sites, for doing the socioeconomic studies and the baseline assessments, to consider whether we're going to do any of the experimental reintroductions, and to develop potential alternatives for consideration. So it's not until that point that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will either decide to propose reintroduction or not. If not, of course, the process ends. If we do propose reintroduction, that kicks off another period of public engagement through the NEPA process. We would have to do an environmental impact statement. People would have the opportunity to comment then. And then there's another decision point where you either choose the no action alternative, in which case the process ends, or if you choose one of the proposed alternatives, if everything else was in place, permits, et cetera, logistics, implementation could then begin at that point. And that's all I have. I'd be happy to take questions.
All right, there was a lot of wonderful information in there, and we've been waiting to have this conversation for a while. So I'm going to bounce back and forth between folks online and folks in the room. So folks online, are there any questions?
Yeah. First question is, will
A little closer, Mike, with
what?
your mic, a little closer to your
Okay.
mic.
Will reintroducing sea otters along the Oregon coast help in reducing and or eliminating invasive invertebrates such as the purple varnish clam and green crab?
Well, I have dreamed of like training them to eat invasive green crabs only. That would be the ideal situation. It certainly would help. I mean, those are potential prey species, but I don't think that sea otters single-handedly are going to take care of that problem, unfortunately, but it would certainly help.
Great. How about questions in the room? All right, John, to the very back of the room.
Was there a chance of the Oregon population, was there a good chance of a lot of genetic or significant genetic diversity loss that's gone, that's not there anymore? That maybe they're not there because it was a different population, a totally different population. And then the other one is, if you're 99% decline of the population, that's 1% of what it was or less, is there any thoughts about how much food there had to be? And is there enough there?
I have not seen any estimates of how much food there was, in the past, to support that population of 300,000? Is that what you're asking? The global population before the fur trade?
Yeah, before they all got wiped out, maybe there was a special population that was just hunted to nothing right away.
I don't know how much food was available for them at that time, if that's what you were asking. But in terms of the genetic diversity, I can say that estimates are that about half of the genetic diversity that was formerly present in the sea otters was lost. We do know that the southern sea otters have the least genetic diversity of any of the subspecies. And that's one of the reasons that we feel they would really benefit from being reconnected with northern sea otters, or at least some occasional genetic exchange, just give them a little infusion of that diversity that they could get from the northern sea otters. One of the other things that we've talked about is it's possible that the southern sea otters being adapted to slightly warmer waters in Southern California, that they might actually have some adaptations that would be helpful for northern sea otters to adapt to climate change. So it could be a beneficial two-way exchange.
All right, question online.
Yeah. Do individual otters eat a wide variety of prey, or do they specialize in a few given what they were taught by their mother?
Yeah, that's exactly right. They very often do specialize, and they will change over time as well, in accordance with what kinds of prey are available to them. So when they first move into an area, they tend to eat, whatever is most abundant. And they also, because they do have such a high metabolic rate, are very choosy in picking prey items that are going to give them the greatest bang for the buck. So whatever is, largest and has the greatest caloric value is what they're going to go after if they can. But there is a large learning component. They do learn from their mothers in terms of their foraging and what to look for. So very often they do specialize.
Your definition of stakeholders in doing a benefit cost analysis, you mentioned existence value. So the stakeholders are not just local communities, they're state residents as well as national residents. Do you have a plan to do a survey to get to some value of existence value of this introduction?
I'm working with social scientists to try and get to that. We did a very small kind of informal survey as part of our feasibility assessment. I talked to, and I worked with the Ocean Science Trust to talk to people from a variety of different groups. So fishermen and people in the tourism industry and people in environmental organizations, and got some of the perspectives that we tried to summarize in our report. But that was just, a very, very small little subsample of the population. So that's part of what we're doing now is we're working with several different social scientists to try and get a better handle on how to capture that kind of information to consider in the future, because that is entirely outside of my wheelhouse, but there are people who do know how to gather that kind of information and analyze it. So yes, that'll be part of it.
Great question online.
Do otters live solitary or in social groups?
They generally live in social groups. It's usually the females will group together with subadults and pups, and the males form these kind of bachelor groups. The only one that's really kind of solitary is with the matriarchal groups, the male that will guard that group from all other males. He's kind of on his own, but that's it. But otherwise, they're pretty social.
Questions in the room? All right, give me a second.
Is there any correlation to population and success of reintroduction of the otter? I'm just thinking the Alaska waters, Canadian waters are desolate, quite frankly. I mean, it takes an effort to get there versus the lower Pacific coastline, higher density. Is there a correlation of population?
Human population? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, human population impacts.
That's interesting. I haven't really thought about it that way. I can say that, otters that are in areas where there's a greater human population face greater threats, certainly. So, in the past, it's been things such as oil spills have been one of the main things we've thought about, boat strikes, being caught by accident in fishing gear are all things that have affected otters. And then more recently off the California coast, one of the big problems they've had is Toxoplasma gondii, which is a parasite that is transmitted through cat feces. And so either through people flushing cat litter down the toilet and it ends up in the water system, or just feral cats, wild cats, whatever, when they have, as they had this last year, these big rain events and it all is washing off into the ocean, that Toxoplasma parasite has quite devastating effects on sea otters. It hasn't been that bad until recently, and now there's this new strain that they've just detected that is quite virulent. So in that sense, I would say, yeah, it could have effect on sea otter populations that, there's just unfortunately so many threats that are associated with having high density human populations around that could affect them.
All right, question online.
Is there any alignment with the 5 established marine preserves in Oregon and the potential reintroduction sites?
Well, we haven't actually established the criteria for the reintroduction sites yet, but that has certainly been suggested as one of the variables that should be considered, is that it might make sense to try and line them up with the existing marine areas, existing protected areas. So I'm certain that will be factor into the equation. Again, though, I have to say, I mean, you can say, here's where we want you to stay. And hopefully they would, because I'm presuming those areas would be good habitat, but I'm not going to guarantee it.
All right, questions in the room? Question online.
Yeah, if urchins are in a starved or emaciated state, will they still provide a good prey source for sea otters? Or will sea otters be more likely to go after shellfish with more meat?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's one that comes up a lot because, as I said, they will go after the most nutritious prey that they can. So when the urchins are in that atrophied state, sea otters will not eat them. And so people have said, well, then what's the good of bringing sea otters back? But what we found, and there are studies showing this, is that what happens is that where you've got little remnant patches of kelp in those areas, by preying on the urchins in those areas, sea otters have promoted the expansion and restoration of those remnant kelp beds where they're present. And then over time, as those start to grow and the urchins start eating again, then the sea otters eat those urchins. And then over time, you do get this expansion of the kelp beds and of sea otters consuming more and more urchins.
Questions in the room? All right.
So with like Oregon losing a lot of its kelp forests and like sea otters can come back, but would you expect like an increase in predation in areas without like the kelp forests for coverage?
So they don't require the kelp, so they can live without it. But kelp does provide cover for them. It provides shelter, and it does help to provide them from predators. Something that is kind of interesting about otters is that they don't have any true predators in the sense of animals that will eat them, except for up in Alaska, the orcas have learned to eat them. But down here, generally, they do suffer from very high rates of shark bite mortality, but the sharks generally do not eat them because they don't have that blubber layer. That's not what the sharks are looking for. So what they found is that juvenile white sharks that are kind of learning what their prey items are, they're kind of tasting them, and of course they taste a sea otter, they take a bite out of it, they spit it out, they don't eat it, but it's killed the sea otter, so they are subject to that. So that's one of the reasons that we were thinking that estuary reintroductions might work better for Oregon, is that you'd be more protected from those sharks. And you'd have more shelter, which would not be provided currently since we don't have a lot of kelp beds off of the coast. We're also doing some research right now on both seven-gill and white sharks and their distribution and abundance off the coast of Oregon as part of the assessment to see what areas might best support sea otters and be most resilient in terms of protecting them from predation.
So everyone, we have reached the end of our time, but before we go, Michele, can you talk to us just again about how we can get involved if we have additional questions or if we want to be involved in those stakeholder conversations? You have your information up on the screen, but maybe you can highlight.
Yeah, you know, and I should have put on there, we do have now, if you go to our webpage, and there's cards out front too that also have that on there. We do now have a listserv that you can sign up for email updates. So we're going to be sending those out as soon as we have these open houses scheduled. If people want to take part in them or give us feedback, any way that you want to remain involved or get in touch with me, my email address is also on that webpage. But we do want to talk to as many people as possible and get people involved. I will just say real quickly, I worked at the Oregon Coast Aquarium over Sea Otter Awareness Week this last September, and it was a real eye-opener for me to find out how many people had no idea that we didn't have wild sea otters in Oregon. I mean, a lot of people really do not know that we do not have them here. So we're really trying to get the word out, get awareness with the public about the fact that these conversations are going on, and get a feel for, you know, whether there's support or opposition or where things stand, and we want people to weigh in. So please do get involved.
Great. And for folks that are online and in the room, remember we have 2 more conversations around this topic, both at Marine Science Day this Saturday. Sarah Graham's talk is at 1. You can join us online or in the room. And then we've got a Science on Tap later in the month. So there's this conversation even here at Hatfield's going to continue. So get engaged, get involved. I think it's worth it. It's an amazing opportunity to listen to you speak. So thank you very much. One more round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We'll see you next time. And thank you, Michele. See you on Saturday. Yeah. Did you see your little room is set up? I did. I noticed it's already set up. I did a little peek. Yeah, I'm going to set it up tonight and it'll be ready tomorrow if you want to come over.